Pokemon Legends EA has huge unforeseen ripple effects on the Pokemon chronology. Set 5 years after X and Y, this is explicitly stated throughout the game, you might think it's a simple case of plugging it into the pre-existing Pokemon timeline. The Pokemon timeline is something I've talked about a lot on this channel. It is one of my favorite topics to cover, and I've thought about it more than I think most people. More than perhaps even the game developers. And yet the game developers must have had something in mind, because across Lumiose City, there are plenty of NPCs referencing the events of other Pokemon games, giving us a much clearer picture, perhaps the clearest we've had in a long time, as to what the events of the Pokemon world actually are. And not just the sequencing of the games, but the history of the Kalos region, which is what this video is really about. If you want to see the overview on the timeline, it's not necessary to understand to watch this video, but I will leave it linked at the end and below. But this video, I'm going to go granular into the history of the Kalos region, its relationships to the other regions of the Pokemon world, and beat by beat tell you the story that leads up to Pokemon Legends EA and beyond. So, those of you who have seen the general timeline overview, which you don't need to watch for this video, but I recommend you watch after if you want a deeper dive, will know that Pokemon X and Y, the Kalos adventure, the first one we go to, is set in the contemporary time of then 2013. Ish. I say ish because it's not like a date is ever thrown out specifically, but it makes sense. The technology has moved far along from earlier games like Pokemon Black and White and Black and White 2, and much further on than those earliest games like Pokemon Red and Blue. What we do know is that X and Y, the events of Kalos and modern-day Lumiose City, are set 3,000 years after the events of a great war. The Pokemon War. 3,000 years ago, AZ, the king of the Kalos region, we don't know what kind of king he was, had a younger brother who coveted his power, wanted it for greed, or at least that's how the histories of Lysander Labs remember it. These brothers went to war in a conflict so dreadful that many Pokemon lost their lives, and one day, AZ's own favorite Pokemon, his friend, his Floette, a very unusual species of Floette, came home in a tiny box. Grief-stricken, AZ decided to end the war then and there. He built a machine that he called the Ultimate Weapon. At first, he used the power of Xerneas or Yveltal, and it depends which version of the game you're playing, of course. The opening cutscenes of those games depict the events a little bit differently, with a red and blue aura around the weapon. Using the life energy of the Pokemon that fought in the war, he revived his Floette 3,000 years ago, bringing it back from the dead, a true miracle. But it wasn't enough for him. He wanted to end the war, to make sure no more Pokemon lives, his Floette's life, would not be taken. So he turned what was left of this machine into a true force of nature, a power that should not be in human hands. We learn in Pokemon Legends EA that the way the machine works is it takes the life energy of Pokemon and distills it into its purest form. Then it releases it in the form of radiation, conduction, or in this case, emission. This weapon sent a bolt of life force energy up into the stratosphere. We don't know much about where it lands, though we do see depictions throughout Pokemon's canon showing that it lands on a city, and all we know is that this event, 3,000 years ago, marked the end of this war. We don't know for how long the war stretched, but we do know that 3,000 years ago is a very significant day in the world of Pokemon. 3,000 years ago, the relic items of Unova are created, the darkest day of Galar happens, and Meltan start disappearing from the world. It's actually confirmed in the game that AZ was there 3,000 years ago on the darkest day, which is going to become fertile ground for many Pokemon theories, but for now, the history. Distressed by the unnatural use of life energy to bring it back to form, Floette left AZ and began to wander the earth. For 3,000 years, its life force seemingly unnaturally extended. AZ's too. AZ began experiencing gigantism as he just continued to grow as the years went on. Until recently, it's not been clear whether he would die one day, whether he was immortal, or just had an extended life force. But his life force seems to be tied to the Prism Tower, a secondary tower that he built 2,000 years ago, when a powerful man who wanted to protect Kalos asked him to make something similar to his ultimate weapon. AZ agreed, and decided to make something that would bring meaning to his eternal Floette's life. He wanted to do it to atone for the sins of the past, so he named it Angie, like angel. And I think the idea of it bestowing eternal life, or bringing meaning to Floette's life, may be that he hoped his life energy, now eternal himself, would be refueled into the weapon. This might be the reason that he passes away the day after the machine is stopped, at the end of ZA. At that time, AZ's younger brother, who survived the conflict, ultimately saw the error of his ways. easy to do when you've had a weapon like that dropped on your head. And he ultimately decides to have the weapon buried under what we now know today as Geosenge Town. South of that town are a number of stones on Kalos' Route 10. These stones, according to a hiker who spoke to Colrus, an expert in this kind of thing, suggest that there's a special energy that emits from the stone, perhaps the residual life energy of Pokemon that we used to funnel the device. In certain depictions, we see actual Pokemon on them, suggesting they might be gravestones or memorial stones to the fallen Pokemon, though many of them are Rhydon, and it's interesting to note that, of course, in the history of Pokemon, Rhydon is often used to represent families of Pokemon, just like in Generation 1. I suspect that's a reason it was chosen, unless we're assuming that the entire war was fought by Rhydon and Abomasnow exclusively. We actually see this symbol of Rhydon as well as a number of other Pokemon in Lysander Labs, possibly just an Easter egg, or possibly the way that people in the Pokemon world think about Pokemon groups in a scientific sense. Anyway, given that there are 64 stones found in the XY games across Route 10, and then other depictions suggest that they look different to how they do in the games, the manga chose them in totally different patterns, it's hard to know if this is the actual true number of stones, and if these really are the grave sites of these Pokemon, whether they're individual graves or mass graves. The lore is just a little unclear. After the burying of the weapon, hoping that time would cover the secret, AZ took his key and at some point began to roam the earth, guilty and in search of his friend. Of course, if AZ was a king in modern day, in our world, he probably wouldn't use an ultimate weapon. He'd just use, well, the internet to create some cyber attacks. That's where today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN, comes in incredibly handy. I love using Surfshark. They're my go-to VPN, and they have sponsored this channel for a long, long time. I use them every single day, and on top of that, we go back so far that my special code with them is code BIRDKEEPER. It gets you 4 months free when you sign up with the link at the top of the description. If you're not sure what a VPN is, it's a virtual private network. It helps protect your data as you browse the internet, which maybe you don't feel that you need at home, but when you're out and about connecting to random Wi-Fis, there are all sorts of ways that your data can get stolen. And with the ability to connect in over 100 different locations, you can access region-locked content, which is just another fantastic reason to have one. On top of that, you can use their really cool clean web feature, which just kind of keeps an eye on like what's happening to your data out there and if anyone's trying to breach you, while at the same time not looking at what you're doing, so that you can just browse the internet with the privacy you deserve. There are so many great reasons to sign up and at least fight back against this form of ultimate weapon, and if you do so right now using my link at the top of the description, that's surfshark.com/birdkeeper, because that's how far back we go, or use my code BIRDKEEPER on checkout, you get 4 months extra for free when you sign up. Thank you, Surfshark, for sponsoring this video, and now let's look back at the Pokemon timeline and what happened to AZ after he fired that weapon. Now, believe it or not, 3,000 years ago is not the oldest date in Kalos' history. It might not have been known as Kalos at this point, but the land 10 million years ago was home to Pokemon like Aurorus and Tyrant and Tyrantrum that ruled as king. But there are actually Pokemon even older than that. There's one Pokemon from Kalos that might be the oldest Pokemon, not including deities that we know about. 300 million years ago is the date that we have for Genesect's Pokedex entries, as well as Kabutops, a date from when these prehistoric lifeforms roamed the Earth. These are very early species, but there is one Pokemon from Kalos that outdates them. Can you think what it is? Formed underground, under intense heat and pressure and a lot of time, Carbink, of all Pokemon, is said to be, well, hundreds of millions of years old. That could make it as old or younger than Kabutops and Genesect, but it could also possibly be older, at most 900 million years, which makes it the oldest Pokemon by far. Its Pokedex entry says, some say that deep beneath the surface of the world, a pack of Carbink live with their queen in a kingdom of jewels, likely of course referring to Diancie, a mutated Carbink. If so, then I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking about the Reflection Cave. It's the only cave in the Kalos region where you can find Carbink naturally, and it's made up of odd mirrors that in the animated series are doorways to other dimensions. And once again, it's just adjacent to the Ultimate Weapons burial site. I do wonder if there's some kind of connection there. 5,000 years ago, across Kalos, we also learned that Go-Goat starts working with people, ferrying them around the place. There are also some Kalos Pokemon with interesting Pokedex entries. They don't have specific dates, but we know that Malamar's hypnotic events might have been responsible for changing some historical event. Maybe our understanding of the war 3,000 years ago, especially if it went Mega Malamar, because that can hypnotize a whole city. I'm not speaking ill of my friend Malamar, just to be clear. Sylveon also has Pokedex entries talking about in history it was helped to use to slay a dragon, but again, that could be in any region. That Pokedex entry first popped up in the Galar Pokedex. So let's get back on to the chronology of Kalos. What happened after the war 3,000 years ago? After the war, the Kalos region began to repair itself, but 800 years later, or at least according to the Pokedex entries, Xerneas or Yveltal, depending on what history you're looking at, awake. They seem to have a cycle of about 1,000 years, suggesting that they weren't actually awake at the time of the war 3,000 years ago, unless 3,000 years is shorthand for about 3,200. But that would be really odd, given just how specific they've been with 3,000 years throughout Pokemon's history. Anyway, Xerneas and Yveltal awake and sleep every 1,000 years, and when they do, when they come to the end of their life cycle or go to sleep and go into a state of dormancy in the Tree of Life or Cocoon of Destruction, they, in the form of Xerneas, unleash life energy, invigorating the people of the region. Of course, if it's Yveltal, it does the opposite, unleashing a deadly wave, absorbing as much life energy as it can, that it might go on a little bit longer. This is very destructive, and thankfully the two powers balance each other out, or perhaps they're kept in check by the order Pokemon Zygarde that oversees the region. More, of course, on Zygarde and the events of ZA as we get there, but let's get there chronologically. As I mentioned earlier, 2,000 years before the modern Kalos adventures, this is when the Prism Tower in its first iteration was built, a beaconing light out to the people across the world. Perhaps this is when Lumiose City began to form. In the very top, in the control room, there is what looks like a throne, so perhaps this is where the ruler of the time sat. Or maybe this is just a control center. Moving into more recent history, many chateaux and castles are built across the region, but the most important is probably the Parfum Palace. There in the garden, statues of Reshiram and Zekrom are just oddly there. Like, it's so clear that this is asking us to make Pokemon theories about it, and there have been many. Could it have been AZ's palace? There's a portrait on the wall that, after you complete the game, your character suggests does look a lot like him. But that's odd because it definitely doesn't. So perhaps it's a descendant or a relative, or perhaps it is AZ having returned 300 years ago to have the castle built and have it honored in his name. Or perhaps the palace is for somebody else and it's just got his portrait in there. We can't be sure. If you're already typing about this portrait, don't worry. It more recently appears in the Lumiose Museum, where current evidence suggests that this actually isn't an image of AZ, but rather a descendant of his brother's line, or an ancestor to Lysander. What we learn from this is that family, AZ and Lysander's lineage, they've always held a position of power in the Kalos region. On his necklace is what looks like a beetle, and one of my wonderful commenters suggested that perhaps this is reflected in Lysander's floating camera things in modern day. We also know from other portraits around the museum that it was around this time that various castles were built for the king's friends around the region, suggesting that the people of Camphor Town Castle or the Revere Walk Chateau, perhaps they were all royals or friends of the royal family. There are a few things to note in the palace, though. One is a backpacker who tells you about the lore and mythos of Hooper, a Pokemon who, according to its Pokedex entries, stole a castle from another reality. So perhaps Hooper, through its hyperspace Lumiose traveling, has managed to bring the Parfum Palace from somewhere else? Maybe it was never built. Maybe it's just when this odd palace appeared. There's also a butler who tells you about a book that has the secrets of bringing Pokemon back from the dead. Something that would make sense to be in the library of a family so obsessed with immortality. On top of all of that, Pokemon Legends Arceus actually has a weird tie to Kalos. You see, we have Commander Kamado, who's probably from the Johto region. He speaks in a Kansai Ben dialect in the Japanese version of the game, which is often associated with that region of the world. But he does have what he describes as Galarian armor. Now, the armor, of course, is from Galar, but isn't it very, very similar to the armor of the Elite Four member Wickstrom? Wickstrom himself seems to think so. Inside the Lumiose Museum, a set of armor, this very set of Kamados, is on display. We also learned from interacting with the Galaxy Expedition Team flag that it's a mixture of cultures that came together to make the Expedition Team. So perhaps before Johto, Kamado had come from Galar, or perhaps it was Lavington who gave him the armor. What we do know is this: by interacting with the armor, we learn that when asked for comment, Wickstrom says that the armor may have been given by one of his ancestors to the Galarian people. However, this isn't sure because the history between Galar and Kalos at this time is, well, unclear. The French translation of the game, however, says that it was a little bit more conflicted. Pokemon Legends Arceus has to be happening between 150 and 300 years before this point. So with that in mind, it seems like at that time there may have been some conflict between the Galar and Kalos region. Perhaps if it lines up, that's why the Parfum Palace was built. Now, looking to contemporary Kalos. At this time, the Kalos region is broken up into 3 core sections: the central, mountainous, and coastal biomes. They have their own Pokedexes. There are 16 cities and towns, 22 different numbered routes in ascending order. Some regions have routes in different numbered orders. I don't really know why. And then at the center of it all, of course, Lumiose City, the City of Light, featuring at its heart the Prism Tower, a Pokemon gym at the time of X and Y. Oh, and there are many other interesting landmarks. The Glittering Cave, of course, houses the fossils of the ancient lost Pokemon, as well as an aquarium featuring all sorts of incredible water life. There's the Tower of Mastery, where long ago it said that a Lucario and its trainer achieved Mega Evolution in the region. Mega Evolution is very well known across the Kalos region. And then, of course, there's the Anastar City Sundial in Anastar City. Some people think this giant pink crystal came from space, others think it's maybe related to Diancie. One thing's for sure, the gym leader of the local town seems to have prophetic visions of the future. She can see through the Kalos timeline. I wonder if she sees Pokemon ZA coming. Anyway, in Pokemon X and Y, the characters of Calum or Serena, the hero of Kalos, team up with some annoying friends on the route just outside their house. Damn, I couldn't help myself. They go on a grand adventure, catching Pokemon, learning the secrets of Mega Evolution, and stopping Team Flare. Lysander is Team Flare's leader, and I've done a whole video about Team Flare lore that is either out now or coming soon. And Lysander seems to be the descendant of AZ's brother, part of the same royal lineage. He has a lot of power and influence in Lumiose City and across the entire Kalos region, having developed a new technology called the Holocaster. And he hopes, given the knowledge he has from his family history, he hopes to use the ultimate weapon again. To use Xerneas and Yveltal, waking them out of dormancy unnaturally, that he might use their powers to fire the ultimate weapon, to destroy Kalos and create a beautiful world in which only he and his minions even survive. This weapon, if fired, is being fueled by the power of the legendary Pokemon Xerneas and Yveltal. Now, we know, because of their Pokédex entry, this is the life force of Pokemon. In Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, this lore, the life force of Pokemon, is developed even further. We learn that a company called Greater Marvel Holdings developed this into a technology called Infinity Energy, and they use Infinity Energies for all sorts of technologies, including a dimensional shifter, in which Zinnia, a lore keeper of old, suggests that there may be another Kalos region out there, one in which the ultimate weapon never fired 3,000 years ago, and thus, as a result, Mega Evolution didn't happen. And one where, because of that, the technology was never researched, and thus that reality wouldn't be able to defend itself. So there are multiple Kaloses throughout history. Obviously, we know this. Pokemon X, Pokemon Y, maybe even one where Mega Evolution never occurred. This is really important, because the idea of this energy being used not only to create portals to other dimensions, but also actually creating other dimensions, is not unreasonable. Pokemon Sun and Moon explore a very similar energy that creates ultra wormholes, and now, of course, we're learning about Hyperspace Lumiose and the hyperspace wormholes of Hooper. Hooper's portals appear all over Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, drawing in Pokemon from other dimensions, not just other places. Again, the Pokédex entry from earlier mentions that it was able to move a palace. And I want to be clear, not just from other places, but also theoretically from other realities entirely. We kind of get a hint of this in the Hooper and Clash of Aces movie, in which Primal Ground and Primal Kyogre are summoned through these portals, even though in modern day they are not awake in this state. And especially because they seem to be coming from a reality with a shiny Rayquaza, whereas the main anime continuity has a regular Mega Rayquaza. Now prepare, dear viewer, for a 3-minute timeline tangent. On top of that, there's a lot of debate and discussion, and I go more into it into that timeline video. The Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire might actually be happening at a different point in history to the original Ruby and Sapphire that happened in a world without Mega Evolution. This is largely because of the depiction of Wally in this game lining up with his depiction in Sun and Moon, which we know is set a few years after Pokemon X and Y. We know this because Dexio and Cena, who are the professor's assistant, Professor Sycamore, have aged up a little bit into the forms that we see here. However, by all evidence we have, Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald happened at the same time as Pokemon Red and Blue, so that would be 20 years earlier, because Red and Blue, the characters have grown up. There's more confusion to this as well, because after Pokemon X and Y and Oras and then Sun and Moon, we get Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, confusing the matter so much by one character, Mina. Mina is a trial captain in Pokemon Sun and Moon. You are supposed to be under 20 years old to be a trial captain, but if that game happened 20 years earlier, well then Mina would not exist. So it's all a little odd. Additionally, Red and Blue, the characters in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, are not the protagonists. Chase and Elaine are. They're traveling the world and stopping Team Rocket. Red and Blue have already gone on their adventures, and they have access to Mega Evolution. Blue specifically tells you about it at the beginning stages of the game, and gives you the Shallow Sable, an item, a delicacy from the Kalos region. This appears in a few other places, including around Mina, of all people, in Pokemon Sun and Moon. It's not actually Mina who gives you the item. It's actually the family and friends of Ilma. Ilma is the first trial captain. They use a Smeargle. Mina is an artist. And artists are a huge part of Lumiose culture. There's a museum, and on Route 8, it's known as Revere Walk. It's a scenic route outlooking the river, and lots of artists, in fact, all the artists of the region, go there to battle. We also learned from Ilma's family that Ilma went traveling at some point before the game, which is where they got the Shallow Sable. So it seems likely that sometime before Pokemon Sun and Moon, Ilma traveled to Kalos and either went with or met Mina, becoming friends, and ultimately getting a Smeargle out of respect for her artistry. This is not speculation. The two are really good friends and mention each other throughout the game. The artist trial captain and the trial captain that uses the artist Pokemon Smeargle, having both met in the place that celebrates art, it makes perfect sense. We do know as well that Blue definitely visited the Kalos region, because in Pokemon X and Y, a person in a Pokemon Center mentions that a Pokemon professor's grandson was here, couldn't quite get a hang of bonjour, but always said, "Smell you later." That's Blue. So you can sort of see how these events might tie together in the timeline. Well, we don't have specific dates. If Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire happen on a slightly different chronology to the original Red, Blue, and Yellow and Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, then it does suggest that the timeline of these Mega universes in which Mega Evolution happened, and there may be many, as illustrated by Pokemon X and Y, happen on a slightly different timescale. But again, for more of that, you can go into my whole timeline of Pokemon video. Right, tangent over, back to Kalos. The window of time between X and Y and ZA is fascinating because while only 5 years, we know another Pokemon game takes place. Pokemon Sun and Moon and its stories events happen 2 to 3 years after the events of X and Y. We know this because of the aging up of Dexio and Xena. We also know that 2 years before the events of ZA is when the Quasartico building was created. This is when AZ reached out to Quasartico and to Vinny specifically to help contain the situation that he could feel, the city crying out in pain, and the rogue buildup of mega energy underneath the Prism Tower. I wonder if this is when it was abandoned as a Pokemon gym. And so Quasartico began to create the wild zones throughout the city. Normally it's Zygarde's job to keep balance in the Kalos region, but 5 years ago after the ultimate weapon fired, it saved Lysander. And then Zygarde splits itself, retreating into the Terminus Cave to begin to heal up, only 50% of its cells showing up there. The other 50% scattered across the world, showing up in Alola. In this time, Professor Sycamore retires from his position as the professor, and Mabel, as well as many of the other Team Flare members, end up taking plea agreements and reintegrating with society. Flare is dispensed of, but Novu Flare starts as a coffee chain. They hope to follow in Lysander's footsteps, and there is no end to the amount of characters who worked with or were inspired by Lysander to make meaningful steps towards a positive and beautiful world. In the post-game of X and Y, this includes a group of ruffians led by Xerosic, one of the previous admins. Looker shows up as part of an international police organization and decides to take on the organization. Looker also ends up teaming up with Emma, an orphan of the streets of Lumiose, and Xerosic takes control of her after they've worked together for months. He puts her in an outfit that gives her superpowers, the Essentia suit. This allows her to jump incredible heights, deal incredible blows, and even get past the locks on Pokeballs. Xerosic is captured by the end of the story, and Looker leaves the Looker Bureau, with Emma taking it over, watching over the city as a sort of superpowered detective. But it seems that Xerosic is actually remembered quite fondly. At the end of the XY postgame, Looker speaks to him in quite a positive tone, and a picture of him still hangs on the wall, playing with Mimi, Emma's Pokemon pal. There is also the Rust Syndicate, which begins to form, a sort of Yakuza group with ties to the Japanese parts of the Pokemon world. And before the events of Pokemon Legends EA, it was actually led by a man called Philippe. Philippe gives his power over over to the up-and-comer Corbeau, who he decides is more talented and can lead the team in a positive direction. They are anti-heroes. Despite their seeming criminal activities, they actually want what's best for the people in the lower classes of Lumiose. They speak frequently of Lysander, and I do have a little side theory here that Philippe is Zorosic, perhaps just wearing a different disguise. And then again, maybe not. In this time, the Stone Emporium of the city remains open. The museum gets in new, interesting exhibits, and Hotel Richemise is still there for the upper class of the city. It's interesting to note that there is a butler in the hotel, not there in the time of ZA, called Chalmers, who also confesses to have once been a Team Flare admin. No one is safe from being involved in this organization. There's also the emergence of the Fists of Justice, a more modern movement, who are dedicated to preparing their bodies for anything, that they might help people and take down the new emerging wild zones, constructed by Quasartico to keep the Pokemon who are drawn in by the energy of the tower at bay, so that people and Pokemon can continue to live side by side. But we are told throughout the story and through NPC dialogues that many people start moving away from Lumiose, as the attraction of all these new Pokemon seems dangerous to them. Both the look of these characters and them wanting to prepare their bodies for anything, as well as being fighting masters, suggest they may have some relationship to those who trained at the Tower of Mastery. There's a lot like Karina, and in order to ascend to the top of the tower, one must prepare their body for all things. So there's a lot going on in Lumiose over the last few years before ZA, and not just in Lumiose, because there are a few NPCs that mention the Galar region. There are a few that mention the Paldea region as well, but the Paldea region isn't mentioned with any sense of time frame or with any nods to the story. However, we do know that Leon is the former champion of Galar at this time. This is fascinating, because up until this point, basically since the release of X and Y, the implication has been that the Pokemon games are sort of happening in their own contemporary times, with them happening in years that line up with the release of the games in our world. But that's no longer the case. Both Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet have both been pretty vague, with not a lot of nods towards the things that have happened in other games. But if there are 5 years between X and Y and ZA, and 2 to 3 years in is when the events of Sun and Moon happen, Sword and Shield must have happened in this short 2 to 3 year window. It may even have just happened by the time ZA has started. As for Scarlet and Violet, we're not sure at the moment, but I will be on the lookout, of course, for more NPC dialogue. Around 6 months before the events of ZA, the first rogue Mega Pokemon start showing up in the street. Tawny or Urbane, the rival, are brought on board by AZ to create Team MZ to find the most powerful Mega Evolution user. And sure enough, 6 months later, you show up, heading into Lumiose City on a vacation. You can actually see them watching Hotel Z adverts on their phone, so they actually meet the rival before they meet them in person moments later. Our hero shows up and takes on the ZA Royale to help AZ and Quasartico with the build-up of rogue Mega Evolution energy. The quest is epic and results in the destruction of the modern tower, taking it back to likely how it looked 2,000 years ago. Inside the top is the control room or throne that AZ once sat. He tried to operate this machine, and eventually it would become his headstone. It's hard to know AZ's full history, spanning 3,000 years, especially when many modern depictions are lies. In the museum in X and Y, there is a mural showing a false history. Even reading the description, we know that Floette was not by his side at the time depicted here. Before he passes, however, Lysander has a conversation with him. Being hit 5 years earlier by the ultimate weapon, he seems to believe that he is bestowed with the same eternal life. He thinks he'll live for 3,000 years, though it's not clear why he thinks this is the case. If so, 5 of them are up. 2,995 to go. What will he do with this time? He won't be wandering the world with his pal Zygarde, who's been looking after him for the last 5 years. Zygarde is the one that rescued him from the ultimate weapon, and as I mentioned earlier, seemed to split itself in half in order to regroup its strength. Half of it, 50%, in the Terminus Cave, the other 50% beginning to collect over in the Alola region. At the end of the game, when Angie misfires the rogue Mega Energy, it is up to Zygarde to stop it, and it does so using a move called Annihilate, a clear nod to the light energy of the Alola region, and it acts a lot like a Z move, which Lysander directly references, so perhaps Lysander was in the Alola region with Zygarde. I mean, there was a Lysander in the Alola region at that time, but that Lysander was from an alternate dimension, an alternate Kalos where he was successful in his plan. So perhaps here, this version of him is immortal. Maybe somewhere out there in the multiverse, an immortal Lysander exists, not a 3,000 years extended life one. It's all very unclear. It's worth noting here, we don't definitively know which Alola Lysander visited, whether it was that of Sun and Moon or Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, but it seems likely, given that Zygarde appears in its more complete state in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, that Sun and Moon are the canonical events that precede this game. There's one other large plot point that's happening throughout the story. Your rival character, Tawny or Urbane, depending on which version of the character you're playing, are looking for their mother. At the end of the game, we learn that it is in fact Jet, the CEO of Quasartico, who is their grandmother, who has been looking for their child. They both put in a plea with the detective Emma of the Looker Bureau to find their missing relative, only for Emma to realize that they may be looking for the same person. We're told this family member is deceased, and we're also told that Jet's family is not from Lumiose City, but we don't know where else they could be from. This is something Jet says. Their family are from some other region, so we are left to speculate whether this is a character that already exists in the Pokemon world, or someone from a region that we have yet to find. One thing's for sure, wherever we go next, we should be on the lookout for this jacket. Given that the Pokemon timeline as a whole is a discussion that Pokemon are willing to have again, with specific dates being mentioned, it means that the Pokemon timeline is going to get very, very interesting. It's also worth speculating on the events of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, as well as the DLCs, because there might be something symbolic going on here for the timeline of ZA. Scarlet and Violet, much like Sword and Shield, are sparse of timeline references, but ZA references the events of the Galar games directly. While the Paldea region is mentioned in Pokemon Legends ZA, the events of the story are not. And this kinda makes sense, because in the DLCs for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, we meet teenagers at the Blueberry Academy who are the children of gym leaders from Black and White 2, suggesting that they have to be happening closer to modern day. Meaning the events of Scarlet, Violet, and the DLCs have not happened yet when ZA is playing out. Then again, maybe ZA is supposed to be representing the beginning and end of the timeline as we currently know it. That's something that while you're subscribing, I want to know your comments and thoughts on down below. If you want to understand the whole Pokemon timeline and how all of these events fit into prehistory and how we landed on some of the dates we did, I cannot enough recommend my full timeline video. On top of that, I want to say a huge thank you to today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Make sure you click the link in the top of the description to get 4 months extra for free when you sign up to Surfshark and keep your details safe while you're online.